So, Daniela is an alum of WA-SEN and actually was a campus liaison for Puget Sound Community College. And now she's currently working for the Partnership for Central America and is pursuing a master's degree in the School of International Service at American University. And so some cool fun facts are that she speaks French and Spanish. Their favorite book from the childhood is The Rainbow Fish, and their mornings are fueled by RX bars and tea. Recently, they just served as a legislative assistant in Seattle City Councilman Lewis's office, and they are focusing on education, early learning. They were also appointed by Governor Jay Inslee to serve a term at the University of Washington's Board of Regents, who I actually directly work with. And Suarez also worked at the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, and so that includes prioritizing, higher education legislation in Olympia that's around equity, accessibility, and then that includes the Washington State College Promise. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome them to the space, Daniela Suarez.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Michael, for that really warm introduction. I'm super pleased to be with you all here today. As a personal note, as Michael mentioned, WA-SEN has a very special place in my heart. I participated in a lot of these summits, and I greatly enjoyed all of the learning and, growth that I had during my WA-SEN journey, working with legislators and being introduced into the legislative process and how to be a part of it. And how to tell my story and how that can have a impact on the legislative outcomes that eventually happen as part of the storytelling process. So today we will be doing some myth busting about myths around the legislative process and working and how we interact with legislators specifically. So I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists today that will go through some of these questions. So first off, we are joined here today by another WA-SEN alumni, Kelsey Monaco. She is a St. Martin's University recent graduate, also graduated from South Puget Sound Community College in 2009. While attending SMU, she served as a campus liaison and a regional coordinator for WA-SEN. And is currently a grad student at Columbia University studying international human rights and humanitarian law. Do you want to say hi, Kelsey?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all again.
Awesome. And Mustapha will be joining us here shortly, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. Mustapha Samateh is a rising senior at the University of Washington, Seattle, majoring in political science and international security. Mustapha currently serves as the student body president at UW. During the 2019 legislative session, he was one of the 2 students appointed to serve as legislative liaison to the Washington State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. So without further ado, I think Kelsey and I will engage on a couple of the first questions while Mustapha joins us. But just to start off, I just want to mention preemptively and say, when I was, learning about, how to engage with legislators, how to effectively tell my story, it can be a daunting process, stepping into this new world and how to communicate with legislators. It can be a little intimidating given, the things that we hear in the political news these days. So we are here today to provide, some general knowledge about our experiences and how legislators are, like everyone else. There are people and they're interested in hearing about what you have to say and how, the issues that you hold near and dear to your heart. But specifically in WA-SEN, we're going to be talking about specifically with financial aid and educational funding. So to start us off, Kelsey, I'll go ahead and point the first question to you and I'll answer subsequently. What advice would you give to a student who is nervous about contacting their elected official that doesn't think civic engagement works or that it matters?
Yeah, well, I think first I would say it does work and it does matter. I think it's very easy to get nervous before meeting a legislator. I know I get very, very nervous. I get super anxious before going into a meeting with them. But yeah, like what you said, they're just normal people. I think with Zoom, it's a lot easier to see like how normal they are. Like instead of going into like their Senate office or like up at the Capitol, you see them just in like their bedroom or something, and you hear their kids like screaming in the background. Like it just very humanizes them, and it just makes it so much easier to just have a conversation with them, talk about your story. And I think one thing to remember is that a lot of the legislators we have right now, a lot of them are older, they're not as representative of us, so they don't know like a lot of our lived experiences. So that's why it's so important to go in and talk about your story, because it really does matter. It does make a difference when you go in and talk about some of the things you've gone through.
No, you make some really great points, and I would agree with you that sometimes I think in the realm of the legislative process, we think, does civic engagement work? Do our stories actually convey meaning, and do those legislators walk away learning something new, and understanding our lived experiences? And what I would say to that is yes. I'll share a story a little bit later on in the panel of how one of those myths were kind of debunked for me. But in short, I would say advice that I would give is that they're just ordinary people just like us. But what I would also add to that is, when you go into a legislative meeting, you have a group surrounding you. So it's not yourself and just your one individual telling one specific story. You have 2 or 3 other people that are there and supporting you as a group. So it's powerful that you all are there, providing stories, lived experiences about how this connects to your life. So you have a team, and you work as a team to put together a message that will resonate with your legislator. So you don't have to worry about all of the onus being on you. And I found a lot of comfort in that as well, because some meetings might have less team members than others, but typically with the good work that Terry and others on this call do, you'll have a good team surrounding you to support you in your meetings. And we have Mustapha.
Hi, sorry for coming late. I was having some internet issues, but I echo everything that Daniela and Kelsey said. Most of these legislators were students at one point. Some of them have kids, some of them went to your colleges. So when you're talking to them, you get to see that you might have a lot in common. So it's very natural, just talk to them like they're your friends or your parents or mentor, or like you're talking to your professor. Just try to like give them your perspective on how your college life has been, because they were students at one point as well, and they really get to relate what we talk about. But yeah.
And they do love when you mention what university they went to. You'll tend to see when you go into some of the Senate offices, or in this virtual space, sometimes they might have a background that says UW, WSU, and they love to connect with you on their experience and talk about their educational journey too. So I would highly suggest that you mention that, and they might be able to share some sort of anecdote, and it'll kind of liven up the whole atmosphere as well. So it's a good tip to keep in mind. Thank you, Mustapha, for that. Moving on to our next question, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Kelsey, on this. As WA-SEN alumni, we were once on the receiving end of these trainings in preparation for next year's Advocacy Day. In the spirit of demystifying interacting with elected officials, please describe an interesting experience or funny story you had while meeting with a legislator.
Am I going first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I think I've really done most of my legislative meetings online, but right before the pandemic hit WA-SEN, we did our legislative summit in person, and that was my first time ever meeting like a representative or a senator. And I remember I was obviously very nervous still, and I think throughout the day we had mostly met with a lot of politicians that matched my political views, and it was really interesting to have these conversations with them. And it was kind of preaching to the choir, we all were on the same page, we all agreed on the same things. And then at the end of the day, we had a meeting with, so from a different political party. And I was really nervous because I don't know what they're going to think about this. My story is very personal. I don't know what they're going to, what the reaction is going to be. But we ended ended going in, and I think we talked to their legislative assistant instead of the senator. So that kind of helped me like be less nervous. I was like, okay, it's not like full on yet. But I think we went in and there's a couple other students with me. And when we first talked about like what universities went to, we ended up all like being at like Catholic institutions. And that like kind of opened up the conversation because the senator, he was Catholic, and then he was like more open to talking about some of our experiences. And that just kind of like eased the mood. Like we all like felt like we all connected in some kind of way. And then it really, like when we left the meeting, it really felt that he had listened to us and like really understood our experiences. But yeah, so I think really when you go in, just like find a way to connect to them on some level. If you can do like some prior research and see the things like they were interested in, like some of the work they've done, what schools they went to, it just can really help lighten the mood and make it a better conversation.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Kelsey, I think in preparation for when, WA-SEN students are going to go do those meetings, we're given that WA-SEN puts together a very robust packet on some of that background research about, the legislators that we're going to be meeting. And I remember as a student specifically, there was one legislator and they would have a briefing packet. So every one of us used our briefing packet and circled and put comments next to the pieces that we could, connect on. So I completely agree with you when you say try to find some sort of thing to connect with them. And the briefing materials that WA-SEN will provide you on the day of or the day before are really great resources to utilize in preparation for those meetings. Do you want to go ahead and go next, Mustapha? I am sure that you have a funny story somewhere in that mind of yours that you've interacted with a legislator that's been a little unconventional.
Yeah, so I happened to do a lot. I did a lot of in-person advocating and educating legislatures, and it was like winter or like winter around January, winter time. So in Olympic, it rains a lot. And WA-SEN, of course, did give us a lot of these folders. But one time I went in and everything was wet. So like all the notes I took, I was like, couldn't like use them. But the legislature was just very graceful. It was Rep Chop, because he's from my district. He was very graceful because he was like, no need the paper, just tell me like, how does it feel to be a student? Are you getting enough support from the state? Are you getting the support you need from your university? How is the financial aid system working? And I was just able to talk directly from my experience rather than stressing about the paper or the note that I took, because it was raining very heavy and everything was just wet. So that's just a reminder that you're talking to a just fellow human and all of that. So they're very friendly and they're just trying to make the space as much comfortable as possible. And also something to keep in mind is when you're talking to legislators, you're giving them a lot of information. Most of them are very passionate about these areas you're talking about. So they will be asking you questions about your personal experience, more question like to get to understand where you're coming from as a student rather than just focusing on the data and the information, which is important, but they really want to hear your personal perspectives too.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I can definitely understand. I think one time when I was at the legislature, it was snowing. It was just starting to snow. And I think the second day that I went back during the state board internship, it was snowed out. Everybody was struggling to stay warm and all the meetings were getting pushed back and forth. So legislators will understand, I think if it continues to be in a virtual context, there'll be a little bit less of that, but they're very understanding on, the different needs and, obviously barriers that people might have in terms of getting there or, getting on time. Sometimes that can be a little difficult given the way that things are structured. So I'm glad that you provided that perspective about, legislators giving grace because they do. They understand that we're students and that everyone else has a lot of things going on. Similarly, but I will share a story, an interesting story about a legislator. I'm not going to mention their name because they continue to be one of those legislators that are just continuously putting up great legislation. But this was in the context while I was a state board intern. So this was not when I was in a WA-SEN meeting, but I share this to offer, a picture about a legislator just being a normal person, because sometimes it can be intimidating to be around people that have really, high profile jobs or are interacting with, hundreds of people every day. So essentially I was going into a meeting with a legislative director from the state board. And essentially this legislator had just come out of caucus, and they were very, very upset about one of their bills and how it was being talked about. And I think there was a lot of disagreement happening. But when the legislator, we went into his office, and he made it very known that he was, visibly upset, but he just started cursing, and he was just very angry, and he was very distraught about how things were going. But at the end, he was like, "I'm so sorry, everyone. It's just not been a good day for me." And he was very apologetic. But that was one of the first interactions I had with a legislator as a part of the state board internship. But that was a very, very unconventional one. So if Joe Holliday is listening in, that was kind of a one-off. But I just say that to say, they have a lot going on. They have their individual circumstances, and some days are better than others. But they're just like us. They're normal people. And in that specific circumstance, he was, very disappointed about how a piece of legislation is going through the process. But I think eventually I got passed, but the process of getting there was difficult. All right. Well, thank you for sharing your insights on that question. As a follow-up, I'm interested to hear a little bit about, as we know, as WA-SEN alumni, we learned the priorities and key messaging of WA-SEN shares is done through, student stories that are developed by the College Promise Coalition, and are aimed to educate legislators on broad issues of importance to students, and, making sure that students make it through college. How did you make sure in your prior meetings with legislators didn't come across as lobbying or specific request on active legislation, since we know that is a unique facet of being part of the Washington Student Engagement Networks? Do you want to go ahead and go first, Mustapha?
Yeah, I can go first. So when talking with legislatures, because their main role is to enact policies and laws in whatever conversations you have with them. But it's like for your role with WA-SEN, it's important to know that you are there to educate legislatures about the importance of investing in higher education and educating them about what it is to be a student right now in this time, and your experience in being a higher education student. So sometimes they will ask you questions about, let's say you're talking about financial aid. They'll be like, well, there's a bill number. Do you know the bill number? Or like, there's this bill number. What's your opinion on it? And at that point, you just have to remind them that you're not there to support or disapprove any legislation. You're there to let them know how you feel, and you're a member of their constituents. So how do you feel as a student? How can they support you, and how can they understand where you're coming from as a student? They can use that information anyhow they want when debating with their colleagues, or like testifying and all of that, with making sure that they're able to support WA-SEN and the students that meet with them in setting those guidelines for whatever action they take afterwards. But as WA-SEN students, it's our responsibility to educate, but not lobby.
Do you want to go ahead and follow up to that, Kelsey?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mustapha kind of covered it. There's like a very fine line between advocacy and lobbying. And basically, to make sure you're not accused of lobbying, just don't say any bill numbers, don't talk about specific legislation. I think it came up before that, you're telling your own personal story. So can you lobby on your own behalf? But because you're there with WA-SEN, I would just say, just talk about your own story, and why it's important, to continue funding education, wraparound services, but don't talk about like any specific bills or legislation.
And there are a couple of key phrases. I think Kelsey and Mustapha covered it really well. There are ways to kind of draw the conversation a little bit back. I had a similar experience when, there was a specific piece of legislation relative to kind of, the subject was coming up, and a legislator was really interested in talking about it and getting into the weeds. And one of my fellow, group members, actively said, well, we'd really like to draw back the conversation to talk about our stories and individual experiences. And I would, use and think of phrases similar to that when you prepared. So whenever you go into these meetings, if something starts to shift in a more specific manner, you can bring up one of those things and say, well, can we step back and talk a little bit more about this specific experience that Kelsey or Mustapha is sharing today? And typically that switch will turn on with the legislator, and they will, try to get back to the subject of the meeting rather than moving on and kind of talking about this piece of legislation. So sometimes it requires a little bit more emphasis, but some other times it's just a gentle reminder that they might need to, just stay on topic. But that's something definitely good advice to provide to you all in case that happens in some of your meetings, because it's pretty frequent, and they're lawmakers. So, they a lot of times the meetings that they do have are really centered about, I don't like this bill or this bill I support. So your meeting might be one of those meetings that's a little unconventional to them, but equally as important in the process. So thank you for providing all those great insights. I hope that we have some time at the end here, and please let me know, Chris, if we're running a little low on time. But the last concluding question that I will ask to all of our panelists is, what are some perceptions or myths about interacting with legislators did you have before your first set of meetings? After you met with your legislators, did that change the way that you thought about the legislative process? Were some of these myths or perceptions that you had debunked? And would you mind sharing those? Do you want to go ahead and start us off, Kelsey, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, sure. I think we kind of talked about this in the first question, but I think my perception at the very beginning was more like, do they really care? Like if I come, like I'm just some random college student, they don't know me, like are they going to care about like my story or anything? And yeah, I think that was very like debunked very quickly. Like, you go in and you have like an actual like real conversation with them. They listen to your story, and they'll like give you, I don't want to say feedback, but they're like talk about their own lives and things that they've gone through. And yeah, like sometimes it's hard to go in and talk about your story. Like sometimes they're very personal, and share as much as you feel comfortable with. But I think it really does help to give your lived experience and tell them why this is so meaningful to you. And it really does make a difference. They do take into account some of the things you've talked about. It might not affect how they vote either way, but it does make a difference. And I've definitely learned that between like, a bunch of the legislative meetings we've done the past couple of years. Yeah.
Do you want to jump in here, Mustapha? I'm interested to hear some of the myths that maybe you had going into the legislative process and how they've kind of changed over, the course of your time advocating as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to reflect. I think some of the myths for me back in the day would be like just getting nervous because they're politicians. You get to see them debate their colleagues. So me bringing in, like, let's say I am supporting financial aid or educating them in that process, I was thinking, well, they would disagree with me. They're going to be asking me questions like I'm in a room being asked questions by like a lot of lawmakers and testifying and all of that, because you know how wild it gets when they're asking you questions. But it was not that at all. It was just like a very comfortable space where I was able to like talk about my experiences, and even if they disagreed, they were like listening to hearing what I have to say, because not everybody will agree with what you have to say, but they listen. And that's really important, because it's important to know that your voice is being heard. And sometimes you get an email saying, hey, I really liked what you said. Can you provide me more information on how it is affecting you and all that? So it tells you that they're really interested in like what you're talking about. And sometimes they follow up with Chris or through WA-SEN just to get more information from students about whatever information we share with them. So that just tells you that it's a comfortable space. And back in the day, I got really nervous because I'm not originally from the US. So that's like, it's not a space for me, but it's an open space for any student to go in and say how the higher education system is working for you or not.
No, I think you make some really great points. Reflecting on that, one of the myths that I had that was very similar was that, is my story going to be able to impact the way that they think about anything? Is it going to make a difference in their thought process of, deciding whether this education is important to them, or supporting students is going to be something of a priority for them? And when I went into these meetings, I thought, well, I'll share my story to the best of my ability, but I'm not going to count on the fact that it might alter their mindset. And well, that can be true. I will share that I had one interesting meeting with a legislator, and this legislator, I was reading a little bit of their background, and they weren't as active or involved in education, and I didn't really know to what level they were really interested in this subject. But when I went in and I was speaking to them, I was sharing my story. They were very quiet throughout the time that I shared my story and my group members shared their story. But by the end of the meeting, this legislator came back and said to us, wow, I had no idea the barriers and struggles that students face on a daily basis and how hard it is to enter an education and continue paying for it, and how there's a lack of X, Y, and Z resources within the higher education system. And he really thanked us for all of our input and stories that we shared with him. And walked away. And I think one of the last things that he mentioned to us is this has really changed the way that I think about education. And this has challenged me to learn more. And I didn't hear from him. I will say I didn't hear from him after that, but I left that meeting walking away as if I provide a meaningful narrative that he could reflect on and that he could maybe look into more, after this meeting. Because like I mentioned, he did not sit on any of the higher education committees or any of the early learning committees. So, for a legislator that was not necessarily actively involved in this space, I really appreciated that he was able to take something away from that meeting. So, that's one of the myths that I think was really transformational for me as part of the legislative process, just knowing that your voice can make a difference. Whether they tell you that openly is one thing, but just know that it does make a difference. And even if they might not say it in the process, that it will touch someone and they will remember your story. And they'll think about it after your meetings, because, legislators, whenever you attach an issue to a story and a narrative, it's easier for them to understand, where you're coming from. And, like I said, I share that experience with you all to just say that, it does make a difference. And the work that you will be doing next year is really important. And I can't speak for everyone, but I also say I really appreciate you all taking your time to, go to these meetings in the future.